22 years ago, Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman wrote a piece for New York Magazine in which he described what it was like growing up in the 50s and 60s, which is, I share with him. We both grew up in the 50s and 60s. He says, the America I grew up in and the America of the 50s and 60s was a middle-class society, both in reality and in feel. The vast income and wealth inequalities of the Gilded Age had disappeared. Yes, of course, there was the poverty of the underclass, but the conventional wisdom of the time viewed that as a social rather than an economic problem. Yes, of course, some wealthy businessmen and heirs to large fortunes lived larger than the average American, but they weren't rich the way the robber barons who built the mansions had been rich. And there weren't that many of them. And, he goes on and he talks about how even, how lawyers complained that people working on assembly lines were making more money than they were. And how, mid-level executives who, today are making hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of dollars, were living in duplexes or split-level homes and had a housekeeper come in once a week. And he says, but they sent their kids to public schools and drove themselves to work just like everyone else. All of that changed when Ronald Reagan dropped the top income tax rate from 74% down to 25%, and then the next year took it back up to 27%. That's when everything changed. That's when the morbidly rich stepped forward and said, we're going to take over America. That's when the morbidly rich actually came into being. Prior to 1980, the average CEO in the United States took less than 30 times what their most lowly paid employee makes. Today, you've got CEOs that are making 1,000 times what their workers make, some that are making 10,000 times what their workers make. Certainly many at most are making hundreds of times what their workers make. This was made possible by tax policy. From the 1930s, the Franklin Roosevelt administration, until the 1980s, until the early 1980s, the Reagan administration, the beginning of the Reagan administration, during that 50-year period of time, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, we had a vibrant middle class. I mean, go back and watch on Hulu or TV or wherever, probably all over the place, the old 1960s episodes of Bewitched, where Darren Stevens, I think was his name, the character who's married to Elizabeth Montgomery. He's the vice president of a Madison Avenue ad agency. And they live in this middle-class, normal house. His boss, Larry, is the CEO of a Madison Avenue ad agency. Now, those people today make millions of dollars because they can. But back then, if you made over $1 million a year, you paid 91% income tax on that money. So people just didn't take the money. They left it in their companies and they paid their workers well. So we had this vast middle class. And it's all, and that vast middle class, which was as much as 60%, and some argued 2/3 of all Americans were in the middle class by 1980 when Reagan came into office. Today it's around 45%. Depending on whose numbers you're looking at, from 43 to 47% are in the middle class. And this is why so many people are pissed off. They remember that in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you could raise a family, you could buy a house, you could buy a new car every year, you could take a vacation, you could save for retirement on one income. And now it takes two incomes to even scratch the surface of that, and that's because of Reaganomics and because of the Reagan, Bush, and Trump tax cuts, which, by the way, sucked $34 trillion out of the economy and left us with a $34 trillion debt. They gave $34 trillion to the very richest among us. We need to raise our income tax rate for the top bracket back up to 74%, where it was when Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981. And then we can rebuild America. Then we can lower taxes on working class people. And then we can have a middle class in America again. This has to be priority one. We'll be right back with your calls.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Defending America from the weapons of mass deception and all those rich people. I'll be right back with you.